Hey everyone, thanks for watching. I got a really exciting topic for you today. Actually, one we haven't done before, and that is we are going to break down fraud. To do that, let's welcome our guest to the show, and we'll kind of break this down. How you doing, Tony Corretto?
Hey, Michael, how are you?
I'm doing very well. As we always do, why don't you kind of introduce yourself to the audience, where you are in this crazy world and what you do in real estate, and we'll go from there.
Great. Well, I live in the mountains just north of New York City, 2 hours north of New York City. You may know them as the Catskills. They have been around for quite some time. And they're, over the last 10 years or so, they've really been experiencing a renaissance. There are a lot of hipsters from Brooklyn living up here now, so I guess that's the sign that we've made it again. So we've been living up here full time for the last couple of years. After I semi-retired, after selling a consulting business, and I do consulting, I do mentoring. I'm an entrepreneur in residence for NYSERDA. I mentor startups. I also a real estate investor, investing in individual multifamilies as well as syndications. And I've been a real estate investor for at least 25 years. So I've done a number of deals, single families, multifamilies. Nothing too huge. No 100-unit, 200-unit buildings. All I think our largest property was a 6-family, which we still have. Mostly 2 families, 3 families, 4 families, that kind of thing.
Very, very cool. So it's fair to say that your 25 years of history, you've been really a buy and hold, kind of just a traditional landlord. Is that kind of fair?
Yeah, small real estate investor and landlord, kind of, the kind of investor who wants to preserve principal and grow with inflation, wants to have an inflation protected stream of income, which, rentals do, which is a great thing, right? Because you can always increase rents, generally speaking, as the economy grows, and your underlying asset will grow in value. So it's a great, conservative investment for somebody like me who, wants to diversify beyond just stocks and bonds and wants to have something that, that doesn't require all that much time and effort and is fairly stable and a different asset class, right? So
for sure. And it does sound like you did some acquisitions on your own and you participated in syndications, which basically meant you were the limited partner or the money side, it sounds like.
Yes.
Was all this generally in New York or the Catskills or kind of like across the nation?
Yeah, a couple of deals. I was invested in a deal with Jonathan through his company, Two Bridges Asset Management, which did very well, and that was down in Atlanta. I had another, limited partner deal somewhere out in California that did pretty well. So yeah, I've invested in syndications which had property, outside the New York metropolitan area.
Very, very cool. So I know we sort of connected on Facebook, kind of talking about, an unfortunate situation that you suffered about 18 months ago. How do you want to break this down? You want to kind of set it up, what it was, what you saw? Do you want to start there, or what do you think?
Yeah, I'll just, and the goal here, one of my goals throughout this process has been to educate people about fraud. And, the more I talk to people, the more I realize that a lot of people have had these experiences and they're just loath to talk about them. But I think that's a mistake because, the more people talk about them, the more investors are aware of what can happen. And the more they realize that there are things they can do to prevent it. You can't always prevent fraud, but you can get your fraud radar up. It's always good to have that up. In addition to your due diligence radar, you got to have your fraud radar up. So it was maybe about 3 years ago or so that I was introduced to an opportunity to participate in these 2 syndications, they seemed, fairly straightforward, right? A general partner had found a deal, found in one case a block of apartments in a condo tower that they were going to buy, refurb, and then lease out as short-term rentals to executives who were coming into the area. That was in Westchester. And then another property also in Westchester that was going to be a gut rehab of an old office building to turn into luxury condos for empty nesters, which also seemed like a great idea because especially in Westchester County, house prices are through the roof, and so are real estate taxes. And as people, downsize, well, in Westchester, downsizing is like moving from a $2 million house to a $1 million house. And instead of paying $50,000 in real estate taxes, you're only paying $20,000 in real estate taxes. So it's all relative, right?
Yeah.
But that it seemed like a great idea for the market. There was a market for that. And the person who introduced me to these deals was somebody who I had worked with before, some years before, on a deal which didn't end too badly. It wasn't great, but it wasn't a money loser, and it certainly wasn't fraud. And all of the paperwork and all of the what you would dot your I's and cross your T's at as you're doing your due diligence seemed to be in place. So, for example, the properties really existed, right? I mean, I went kicked the tires, looked actually at the physical properties. Spoke to the construction managers. Looked at the financials, right? There seemed to be actual bank statements and actual, financial records. Spoke to some of the other limited partners who were putting money in. The things that we, usually did, ran the numbers myself. Took a look at comparable properties to see whether this seemed like the numbers were making sense. And it all seemed to, make sense.
Okay.
I should have at that point when I was getting into these deals, I reviewed it with my wife, and that's my rule number one now, is always review everything with your spouse, because your spouse will often notice things that you will not, because you get involved in the heat of the deal and the numbers, and you want somebody who is kind of, who has a deep connection to you and is looking out for you, but is not necessarily deep in the weeds with you and on the details. Thank God I talked with her, because she's, suggested dialing down the investments. I was going to invest more in these properties. And she said, well, why don't you do half?
Okay.
And so my losses would have been twice as great if I hadn't talked to my spouse. So,
wow.
So I guess my rule number one is always talk to your spouse or significant other. But that being said, having passed, my due diligence and having had my attorney read through the subscription documents and done all that stuff, I invested. And, the amount I invested was not huge. I have a limit, and one of the things that saved me in this, and I think should save everybody who is investing in a risky asset class, whether it's private equity or syndications or something that you're not intimately involved with as a person or as a sole owner, is limit your total exposure as a percentage of your net worth.
There you go.
So, I've got this rule, and I have no more than, 7 or 8% of my net worth tied up in any of these things. So this particular, in these two particular investments, wound up being probably about 1% of my net worth.
Okay.
So it could have had the potential to, produce great returns. And the absolute cash returns would have been really nice as extra income, and primarily we were looking for ways to generate income. And these promised a decent coupon, which a lot of syndications do. You've got an upfront coupon, and then you've got a back end kicker when the property is liquidated, and and then the general partner takes his share, and then the limited partners participate. So that all seemed to make sense to me, so we went for it.
Okay.
And for the first about 18 months of these deals, everything was hunky-dory. The payments came on time every month. I was kicking myself for not investing more because the payments were nice. And one deal was yielding 8%, the other deal was yielding 11%, which, was great. And then, one day I get this phone call from the general partner who said, I wanted to introduce all the investors to another big investor we're having come in here, because we had one lead investor who was, had a personal guarantee that was backing some of the investments, which was another point of security on this, right? We had somebody who has had a personal guarantee, who
Mm-hmm.
put in millions of dollars, and we saw his balance sheet, right? He had personal balance sheet of like 50 million bucks, right? We knew he was good for it. So we thought, wow, that's great. Well, this person was apparently, backing out of the deal, and we're substituting that capital for somebody else. And so the general partner wanted to introduce us to this new person. So that was a little odd. And then we got introduced to this new person, and then all the wheels started coming off all at once. So within a week of my having that conversation, the general partner was arrested by the SEC for fraud on another deal, which was completely unrelated to our deal.
Wow.
And he was in jail. And then it turned out that the new investor that he introduced us all to turned out to have been this guy from like Portugal or Spain or someplace who was also a fraud. I mean, this guy was apparently, running around the world convincing people that he owned jets and was a billionaire when the guy had no money and was, classic scam artist. Well, it got worse and worse because not only did the payments stop at that point, because under the pretense that the new investor was getting his arms around things and the old investor was pulling out, and so we had to restructure, whatever that meant, right, in quotes. Then it turned out, as we found out, that not only was the original GP in jail and a fraudster from way back, which we had no idea of, the new guy was also a fraud. And then it turned out that now there were a whole bunch of like foreign investors who were involved, who we didn't even know were involved, and everybody started suing everybody else. The original the original anchor investor started suing this new guy, claimed that the new guy made him sign over his interest in the property without due consideration. So they were suing to get control back. Meanwhile, the properties, it turned out that unbeknownst to the investors, one of the properties, a majority interest had been sold to another investor without us even knowing about it. So we had like literally no interest in the property remaining.
Wow.
And that had happened months ago. And then the other property was forced into bankruptcy by one of the vendors who was working on the property.
Sure.
And the whole so this all happened within 18 months was perfectly fine, and then within a matter of 2 or 3 months, it all went to hell, and all of this stuff came out, and it was just mind-boggling. That was just a huge shock to me, because nothing like this had ever happened to me before in 30 some odd years of investing and 25 plus years of real estate investing. I had done well in all those years of investing, and this was I guess in retrospect, having gone for 25 years as an investor, a real estate investor, without experiencing any kind of fraud, was kind of a good run.
Yeah.
And it was bound to happen, sooner or later.
Yeah.
But what happened next was actually the best part of this story is that the investors all banded together, or most of the investors all banded together. We found ourselves through the various brokers who had put us into these nightmares. And turned out that there were like 47 of us,
Okay.
47 or 50 of us, right? A big number.
Yeah.
And we hired an attorney, and we did some investigation, and it turned out that, there would have been so much brain damage and additional investment required to get even a tiny portion of our money back that, we declared losses.
Yeah.
But, now there are still, I won't say more on this, but we still have attorneys representing us who are now going after various parties involved. So,
For sure.
a year and a half later, we're not giving up. We are banded together, and we are a community now of investors. And, these are all seasoned investors who have been investing for years, all high net worth individuals who, all feel embarrassed about having been in this, but we're also angry and we're determined, not only is this never going to happen to us again, but we don't want it to happen to other people again.
Yeah, that's a wonderful story. And what you've just outlined is something I've actually put it out there. I've talked to Jonathan about this. Is one of my greatest fears is going to happen in more numbers than we want to expect, kind of around 2022, 23. I think there's a lot of syndicators that are, one step away from becoming crooks because, they've done 2 or 3, they've worked out because the last 5 years have been pretty good. And pretty soon they're going to start taking from syndication A and paying syndication B because they want their return to be the same. And now you have, a Ponzi scheme. And
right, exactly. You're right, exactly. You're just one step away from a Ponzi scheme, right?
Yeah, exactly. So that's my greatest fear. Because again, I think we're at the top of the market. I think there's lots of people pitching skinny deals. I've been investing for nearly 20 years and I'm afraid. So I'm glad we're talking about this, especially both as experienced individuals. So let's try to break this down for folks, right? So you talked about talking to your spouse, right? Always get them. She saved you half. You have a personal rule of nothing more than 7 to 8%. The way you told that sounded like it was a pre-existing rule, meaning you don't
right.
have,
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. That was a pre-existing rule. Right. So yeah. And I'm again, really, really happy that I had those 2 rules in place. And limit your exposure.
Yeah.
And I guess the third rule is limit your exposure in any one deal to,
sure.
A tiny fraction of that, so, and I kind of broke that rule because if I had paid attention to that rule, I probably would have put half again as much as I had put in, right? I would have reduced it by even half, but the returns were just so enticing that, I ignored that.
Yeah.
Right. So don't ignore your rules. If you've got rules in place for good reasons, limit your exposure. The reason you're in this asset class is, to broaden and diversify and hopefully de-risk, not to increase risk.
Yes.
So you want to keep that rule in mind. And the key to that is diversification. You really, really can't have so much in that it's going to hurt you when you when inevitably when one of these deals goes south. And this is kind of like, we should borrow, as real estate investors, we should borrow this from private equity investors and venture capital investors, because their rule is out of every 10 deals, 1 is going to be a superstar, right? And that's going to be like a 7x return. 3 or 4 or 5 are going to be middling, fair to middling returns, maybe double-digit returns. And then, 3 or 4 are going to go to 0. They're just going to be totally worthless. And as real estate investors, we're kind of not used to the 0 part, It's like, true. Oh, well, we understand that we can have substandard returns and maybe we could lose a bit of money, I mean, if you bought we bought an apartment in Manhattan in 1988. And that was, at the time, that was a market top, and we sold in 1994, which was a market bottom. I should have held on to that apartment, and it would have been worth 3-4 times what I sold it for then. But I did buy, a house at the bottom of the market, so that was great. But we tend to think, oh well, we can. If you've invested in a down market, we've all invested in down markets. You're going to get some of your money back, unless you're highly leveraged, unless you're 90% leveraged, 95% leveraged. You're going to get some of your money back. But what if you get none? You get none back? Yeah. Well, we should think like that, right? We should think, especially if you're in syndicated deals, because one thing I learned is that no matter what's on paper, and even if you kick the tires on the physical property and you talk to people, there's still a chance of fraud. And unless you personally are buying the property yourself, unless you are the GP,
right,
and you trust yourself, right, who you are, and assuming that neither you nor I are a fraudster and we're not going to defraud other people, we know what we're going to do. We're going to line up the financing. We're going to buy the property. We're going to manage it correctly. We're going to distribute cash to investors. We're going to handle all that correctly. But if you're not us, that's an unknown. It really is an unknown. Anybody who is not you, it has the potential to be a complete 0. So that's something I just did not realize, until this happened. The other things I think I realized is that, personal relationships are extremely important, and I would never invest with anybody in a future syndication deal unless I knew them personally and had already invested with them or had worked with them in some other capacity. So Jonathan is a great example of this
Hmm.
because, I had met him through a networking event. We both went to the same college, we had a background together. Other people that I knew him.
Yep.
And so when he came up, when he approached me about his first deal, it was like, okay, I'll try this out. And I followed my rules with Jonathan. I did not put in a huge amount of money. It was like $50,000 or something. And it turned out to be fantastic.
Yeah.
And now Jonathan's on my A list, right? I
Yes.
mean, if I'm going for a future investment, he's going to be the first person who calls me, and I'm going to call him first.
Yeah.
And likewise with, I've got this roster of people, and Jonathan's not the only one, of folks who have made me money.
Yep.
And who I trust. I've got this guy who I've done private equity deals with, a good friend of mine who lives in the city, and we've known each other for 15 years. We've done private equity, and private equity is another one of those things where, there's a lot of shady characters in private equity. How do you really know what you're doing? Well, I'm buying shares in a company. What, really? As far as I can tell, you're looking at a spreadsheet, which is
Exactly.
a bunch of
got a logo
colors on a screen, right? I don't know what that means. And even if you go to a physical location, we know that you could just rent an office and decorate it and hire people to come and sit there. I mean, it could be fraud.
Could be.
So the important lessons here are have your own rules. Work with people you absolutely know and trust. You cannot work with people who, and I broke that rule too, because the person who brought me into this deal was somebody I had known from a prior deal, like 5 years ago, and it wasn't such a great deal. And, when he called me, he was like, well, I don't know, I'm really not sure, but this sounds good, but I don't really like this guy. Really, it's like, follow your gut on people, man.
Yeah.
You really, really have to do that. And I will never, ever again invest with somebody who I don't know intimately, who I've had dinner with. I know their families. Because that's who's going to make you money or lose you money. It's the people.
Absolutely.
And you must have absolute 100% faith in them. And one of the other investors in this deal with us, who lost money, I was talking with him, another sophisticated investor who's been around the block, said, I've done due diligence on a zillion deals, and been defrauded twice. And, it was once this time and once, some years ago. And he said, what I've learned is that you can do diligence a lot of things, but you can't do diligence fraud. And that's a good thing. That's a good lesson to remember, because fraudsters can know exactly, a good fraudster knows exactly what he needs to do to check all the boxes for due diligence. You want a site visit, you're going to get a site visit. You want financials, I got you financials. You want a bank reference, I got a bank reference.
Right.
So very clever, right? I mean, all of those things can be faked, can be forged, they can be exaggerated.
Yeah.
And even if all those things go well, as in our case, those up front, the numbers look good. What can happen along the way can be a disaster, right?
Yeah.
So like the general partner in our case was not functioning like a general partner. He had a fiduciary responsibility as a general partner, but instead, how do you sell out an asset from underneath a partnership without letting the limited partners know? That's the asset that's guaranteeing the return. What? How do you do that?
Yeah, that's crazy. So a couple of things have come up. I've taken notes on. First and foremost, one of the things I love about Jonathan and why I would invest money with him is he's not like always positive, right? These people that are today talking about that, trees grow to the heavens and everything is good, they freak me out, right? You keep telling me that the returns are going to be 10% forever. I run the other way. Tell me about the scary stuff, right? And Jonathan sold his portfolio, right? I did an interview with him probably 6, maybe 9 months ago, where he's like, I'm out, right? I sold all 300 units or 410 or whatever it was, because it's the top of the market. I like that, right? It's hard to be a syndicator with no assets. I respect that, right? So show me that person. And then the other one I wanted to ask you about, do you think, so I think I know the answer, but I'll ask the question anyway. Do you think this was fraud from the jump, meaning day one, or do you think something happened and it became fraud somewhere, after
Yeah,
acquisition?
I don't think it was the first case. I think it was the latter case.
Ah,
Um,
okay.
I think it was not from day one fraud. I think that given now what we know, because we've spent, you know,
Yeah.
the past 18 months or 20 months now investigating, and what we've uncovered is like it's probably, if you diagrammed all this, you plotted it all out on a bell curve, this would be at the extreme tail, right, of weird outcomes,
Sure.
because it was like everything that could possibly go wrong went wrong. On the renovation project, the condo conversion projects, expenses were way over what they thought there were going to be physical problems with the building.
Right.
And then, so over budget, too much money being spent. Then you have contractors kind of walking out. This is classic stuff, right? A contractor
Yeah.
takes a deposit, walks out,
Yeah.
and you got a half-finished HVAC system. Now you got to hire another contractor, and it's going to cost twice as much.
Yeah.
So basic stuff like that. But then, as time went on, those basic problems then that were sort of could have been forecast, and if you had a bigger budget, and if you accounted for the downsides, right? Like Jonathan is like,
Hmm.
okay, I'm going to be very conservative about this, and if my budget is 100 grand for repairs, I'm going to make it 200,
Right.
and I'm going to go to the limited partners and raise that much money because I don't want any downside surprises. I'd rather have upside surprises than downside surprises.
Agreed.
So
Yep.
these guys did not do that, right? They just did. They were operating razor thin. So when you do that and you have razor thin budgets, and you suddenly now are in a position of needing money, well,
Yeah.
that's when fraud happens, because now it's
Absolutely.
like, well, I don't know if I want to tell the investors that because they're going to get spooked. So maybe I'll get another investor come in here, and I won't tell the other investors about this investor, and he'll give me some cash, but I'll sign a side deal with him. I mean, we found out all kinds of crazy shit that went on that was
Yeah.
just, our jaws were dropping. It's like, how did that happen? Why did that happen? Why didn't they come
Yeah.
back to tell? We were kept totally in the dark because the general partner just did not want the wheels to come off earlier.
Yeah. Well,
So
yeah. So this
you've
is
got to,
this.
that's,
Yeah. This is my
it
greatest
goes,
fear.
yeah,
This is
it goes,
this.
it goes down to the character of the general partner,
Hmm.
and what will happen when, what will happen if expenses get too high? What will happen if the building manager walks out? What will happen if, there could be other fraud, right? What
Hmm.
happens if and Jonathan told this story of a friend of his who invested, who bought a great property because the prior owner was like an absentee Wall Street guy who had this property and had a property manager who said, oh, this is a terrible performing property, the rents are low. It turned out that the property manager was defrauding the owner and pocketing rents and claiming that he couldn't rent things. He was renting, but he was
Yeah.
pocketing the money.
Yeah.
So it's like, whoa. So what if you can't trust your property? So
Yeah.
when you can't trust the general manager to do a good job of managing and communicating, then kind of the door becomes open to fraud.
Yeah.
So it could start out as a good deal,
Right.
and then if if it's not on a sound financial footing, then fraud can creep in if people don't want to be open about what's actually happening.
Yeah.
So that's what happened here.
Yeah.
I think it started out, what we know about what happened is that it started out as a reasonable deal,
Right.
and then because the financials were not secure, not
Hmm.
enough money was raised up front,
Yeah.
and too high returns were promised,
Yeah.
that the wheels started falling off and fraud started creeping in. And then when the anchor investor backed out, it was like, oh, I can't take this anymore. I'm losing. This guy lost millions of dollars on this.
Right.
And then it turned out that in a bizarre saga, it's like, his daughter was writing checks that he didn't know
Oh,
about, and
Jesus.
then his ex-son-in-law was forced him to put more money in. Like there was inter-family fraud going on here. It's like,
Wow.
whoa, when that happens, this is like those soap operas on, like the Dallas soap opera, right?
Yeah.
Where all family members are against each other.
Yeah.
That can happen.
Yeah.
And if that happens, you as a limited partner have no protection against stuff like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, so it can start out, this is like the worst of all possible worlds, right? It
Well,
can start out
yeah.
fine and then wind up as a fraud.
Well, I think that is unfortunately going to happen a lot. We have a lot of new syndicators, people that picked up that mantle, put it on their business card or LinkedIn in the last 3 years. They haven't done a deal. They don't know what conservative is. They don't like delivering bad news. They don't want to do capital raises. They don't want to take the preferred return from 6 to whatever.
Yeah.
And I unfortunately think that what happened to you is going to happen in great numbers. It starts out as an honest deal from an honest person who then doesn't know how to handle stress, doesn't know how to deliver bad news, and people are going to go to jail and people are going to lose a lot of money. That's my greatest fear.
Yeah, and I think I'm kind of in the same camp with you and Jonathan. I'm very conservative,
Yeah.
and I like to overestimate the bad stuff, and I'm glad that I did. Not that I was prepared for the fraud, but
Yeah.
at least I had some parameters around it.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, it had a happy ending, right? Because it was like 1% of my net worth. I made that money back in a few months,
Right.
last year. So, and I wrote it off on our taxes, right? So that wrote off other investment
Sure.
gains. So I said there, it's like, well, so yeah, well, I would rather it didn't happen,
For
and it
sure.
stung. Wasn't fatal by any stretch of the imagination. My net worth is higher now than it was then. That's
Right.
fine. And it didn't really hurt my income, because that income got replaced by income from other investments.
For sure.
So it was just a really painful lesson to learn. But now I have this community of people
Yeah.
that we're in touch constantly. We are keeping each other kind of abreast of what's happening in the world of investments. We've now all learned these lessons. So now I've got 50 people who've learned lessons. And frankly, I wouldn't say I'm on a crusade to spread the word, but I want to spread the word. I
Right.
want to spread the word that there are fraudsters out there that, especially now, if you and I and Jonathan are right, and we're at the tail end of this
Yep.
expansion, and too many people who don't have any business being in this business are in this business,
Yep.
it's going to be a big shakeout, and a lot of people are going to get caught.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are going to have to turn to fraud because they can't communicate well. They don't want to issue a capital call. They don't want to scrimp on their preferred return. And they're going to do anything to, including a Ponzi scheme
Yep.
to make sure that doesn't happen, to give the appearance that everything is okay. But eventually,
It'll come out.
that's going to fall apart.
Yeah.
And somebody's going to go to jail and investors are going to wind up with nothing.
Exactly.
So we all have to be much more careful.
So let's talk about there's one thing. So again, I think your upfront due diligence, if we say it was a good but thin deal in the beginning, it sounds like that was okay. You had that covered. What should somebody do in the middle of it, right? You're 18 months in, you're cashing the checks, you're living well on this investment. But I mean, what was the indicator that how do you check for, can you tell me bad news? I mean, that's really the miss here.
Right.
How
Exactly.
could a new investor who's only been in one syndication, they've done one deal, how can they call their GP or maybe another partner and just check that stuff out? I mean, how would you check for that? Any idea?
Well, I think that you put your finger on it. I think that that one of the things that I should have done from day one was demand a list of all the investors so I could speak to them, so we could have our community from the very beginning. It's like, I don't want to be in a silo here by myself. I want to talk to the other investors and see what they're hearing, because investors, one investor may hear something that another investor doesn't hear.
Yep.
And if the general partner is not communicating well, I'm going to get it from the other investors. So that's my sort of backstop guarantee to keep the GP honest. It's like, well, if you're really honest, then you'll tell me who all the other partners are, because then you have nothing to fear, right? You have nothing to fear whatsoever if I'm talking with the other guys. The second thing is, I would just make myself a pain in the neck to the general partner and say, if I don't hear from you once a month, I'm
Yep.
calling you.
There you go.
And I want to know what's going on. And by what is going on, I mean, what's the balance sheet? What's the P&L? Are there any unanticipated expenses this month that are beyond the pro forma?
Yep.
Are there any upsides beyond the pro forma? I mean, it could happen, right?
Yep.
I mean, gee, we had fewer, our vacancy rate was lower. That's fantastic.
Right.
Then let me hear it. I want to know the good news. Or, if there's something unanticipated, well, what do you think? And answer the question for me, which Jonathan is great at doing, is, what could happen?
Yep.
What's the worst that could happen now? Knowing where you are, gee, we're heading into a recession or we're heading out of a recession. Given the macro climate, what should we be doing? Should we be doing anything different? How's the manager, the building manager? Are they good? Are they ready to manage in a downturn? Can they deal with higher vacancy rates? What's their plan if there's higher vacancy? Are they going to give concessions? Are they going to waive fees? How is that going to work? Let's talk about that. And if the general partner is like hamming like Jackie Gleason,
Yeah,
then maybe we should, that's a bad sign. And I would have heard that in those conversations early on.
Yeah, for sure.
So I think having, knowing, staying in touch with the other partners, knowing who the other limited partners are, and then making yourself a pain in the neck, and make yourself a pain in the neck before you sign the deal.
Absolutely. Yeah.
That's really, we're trying to prevent fraud here. So,
yeah.
Ask the general partner, well, is it, can I talk to the other investors? And B, what are you doing next Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday? Because I want to sit down and talk with you, and we're going to get into the real details of this.
Yep.
If they don't have time for you, and they're not going to be open kimono about the investor base and about their approach, and they're not willing to make the time to, then walk away.
Yep.
It's just absolutely not worth it. If somebody is not totally 100% transparent and they're not willing to make the time, it's your money. Absolutely. If they're not willing to make the time to get your money, then forget it.
Yeah, totally agree.
Absolutely forget it.
Yeah, my hope is people watch this. The title will include the word fraud and syndications in it. So what I expect is going to happen at the end of this, Tony, is a lot of people are going to want to reach out to you and ask questions, or maybe even share, hopefully not similar stories, hopefully not, but maybe.
I know they're out there, but it's fine if you want to share them.
Yeah, but how can they get a hold of you?
I would love to hear them, frankly, because if the more we learn about this, the more we can learn about the mental models of fraudsters.
Yeah,
and how we can we have to think like fraudsters. Well, how would we do this? How do we prevent fraud? It's like being a white hat versus a black hat hacker.
For
right?
sure. Yeah.
So,
exactly.
So if we want to be white hat hackers, right? We want to hack our own deals. It's like, well, all right, if I were a fraudster, how would I fraud this? Oh my God. Well, I have to think about that now.
Yeah.
So the more we have in our dictionary of potential cases of fraud, what they look like and how these people actually think. I mean, it's difficult for those of us who've never even thought about this stuff and are on the receiving end of it to even think about that. But we have to think like that, I think, to protect ourselves.
Yeah.
So anyway, the more people want to share those stories, I think the more that we have a greater chance of assembling this, dictionary of disasters that can help more people avoid them.
Absolutely. So how would you like people to reach out and get a hold of you? Because I suspect a lot of people are at least going to want to ask questions because they don't want to be frauded, but I'm sure you're going to hear some interesting stories as well.
Yeah. Best is to reach me on I have a blog called declaringfreedom.com, which is, all about my experiments with personal freedom. And that's the best way to reach me is through that email address. It's Tony, Tony, at declaringfreedom.com. So just the word declaring, the word freedom.com.
Very cool, Tony. That's a lot of fun. I'm sorry this happened to you. It sounds like you're a better man for it. I got to say that, right?
Absolutely. I am a better man for it. I feel great.
There you go. Well, Tony, I appreciate you giving us some time today. This has been a great story, and let's hope we've caused some people that are evaluating syndications to ask some hard questions, and people that are in syndications to ask hard questions.
Yeah, absolutely.
I see some negative surprises in the future.
Yeah, that's the goal. We got to